All right. Okay. Thank you for the reminder. I always forget something. So thanks, Rich. So today we're joined by some guests from the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. I think Deputy Commissioner John Binder is going to be leading us through the presentation from New York. John Binder is, as I said, the Deputy Commissioner at the Department of Environmental Conservation in New York. And I've had the pleasure of working with John for many years on the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative program when he was counsel at New York DEC, and now he's moved on to a new and exciting role there and is leading the DEC's New York Cap and Invest program development in New York State. So I also see that Mike Sheehan from the Bureau of Air Quality in New York, also at DEC, is on with us today as well. Mike is the Director of Planning for the Air Quality Bureau, and is also working on the Cap and Invest program in New York, and is also works on the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative program as well. I don't see that Lois is on yet. Is she joining us today?
She's having she's attempting to. She's just having some technical difficulties, but she should be joining us shortly. I think we can go ahead.
Lois, hopefully that she works that out, but Lois New is also with the New York Department of Environmental Conservation and has been working on climate programming for the department in New York for a very long time, also a RGGI veteran, and now working specifically consulting on the development of the Cap and Invest program. So thank you to all three of you for joining us today. We really appreciate it. We're really excited to learn more about this program. So John, I'll kick it over to you to walk through the presentation and let me know if you have any trouble sharing your screen and I can throw the slides up. Oh, here's Lois. Lois has just joined us.
Perfect timing for Lois. Yes, thanks Megan for the introduction, and it really is exciting to be here with all of you. We're really happy to be having this conversation with you all. It really is part of our outreach that we're going through as we develop this program and making sure that we're having conversations with all types of stakeholders, but the conversation with state stakeholders is particularly important as we want to make sure you're well informed about what we're doing, and so that you can consider maybe potential options for Vermont to participate in the program going forward. So I am going to try to share my screen. Let's see if this works. Can you see that?
Yes.
Now this should be the beginning of the slides, I hope. All right, so I'm going to spend like maybe 15 or 20 minutes just giving you a quick overview of the program and kind of what our process is looking like. And then I want to make sure we have a lot of time to answer what I imagine are a bunch of questions from you all. I do want to emphasize before I begin that, as was mentioned at the beginning, we are relatively early in the design of this program, and so we might not be able to answer all of your questions, just because we haven't made final decisions, right? The nature of a regulatory process like this is we do stakeholder outreach before we propose a rule for public comments, and so that's where we're at. So I just wanted to kind of emphasize that first. I know that might not always be satisfying. And it's not to me either, but that's by design, right? Because we want to get input from all kinds of stakeholders, again, especially those like you from Vermont and other states. So going right into this presentation, before we go into kind of the details of the program itself and really some of the specific issues that we're working through and seeking input on from stakeholders, we did want to kind of just give an overview of our process so you can understand kind of where we are. Again, as I mentioned, we are relatively early in the process of developing this program. We're at kind of the second phase in this chart here, right? So last month in June, we held a series of public webinars where we kind of peppered stakeholders with questions. We received some initial input from the public, and now we're in the process of evaluating that input. Our plan is to go out sometime later this year, probably in the fall, with a second stage of pre-proposal outreach. At that point, we would hope that we have, some program leanings of where we think we're going to go, rather than just asking questions of stakeholders. And then we would then evaluate additional input at that point, and then we would get to the formal phase of public notice and comment that I'm sure you all are familiar with on the regulatory side. So I just wanted to kind of give that overview of our process before we got into some of the details. I also want to make sure you all understand how to follow along the process if you are interested. The key thing is this website, which Megan helpfully included in the meeting materials. Thank you, Megan, which is capininvest.ny.gov. So all of the meetings that we held last month are available there, the recordings and the materials. When we do have this next phase of outreach later this year, it'll all be available there as well. You can sign up to get email alerts from us as well. So, just want to make sure you are kind of able to follow the process as much as you would like as we move forward. So kind of what are we going to cover today? So we, meaning Mike, Lois, and I, the New York team, we can be with you all until 1 p.m. But before we get into the questions and discussion, which I'm sure you're the most interested in, we just wanted to kind of give a broad overview. So we intend to give a brief summary of our Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. We'll call that the Climate Act or the CLCPA. That's our state statute. That is really why we're here. I mean, we're here because we want to all address climate change, of course, but as a legal matter, we're here because of the statute that is requiring us to ensure as a state that we meet emission limits. So I want to give you that background, explain a little bit of kind of how we got to the point of working to develop a cap and invest program. That might be of interest to all of you on this cross-sector subcommittee because we had a similar process with a scoping plan developed under our act, which had a series of sector-specific recommendations. But in addition to those complementary policies, it also had a recommendation for a cap and invest program. So we'll give a brief overview of that. I'll spend a little bit of time on some of the details of our program, again, as we currently conceive of them. And I'll also focus a little bit on some of the unique features that we intend to have in our program as compared to maybe some other cap and invest programs that you might be familiar with in other states. And that includes, of course, the RGGI program that Vermont and New York are very, very long-standing participants in, as Megan mentioned in the beginning. And then, I want to make sure we spend time at the end to briefly touch on opportunities for continued engagement with Vermont and other jurisdictions, and then we'll go into the next steps and questions. So just to kind of give you all an overview, again, for us, it's the Climate Act, the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act that really sets New York State on a path towards a carbon neutral economy. That's a statute that mandates that we get at least an 85% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions statewide by 2050. That's from 1990 levels. We also have a more near-term target of a 40% reduction by 2030. And to help achieve those emission reduction requirements, we also have electricity generation requirements. So the electric sector is required to be 100% emissions free by 2040. 70% is supposed to be renewable energy by 2030. We also have these specific targets for specific kinds of energy generation and storage. So that's all already written into our statute, the Climate Act. In addition to that, one of the key parts of our law that we are always keeping in mind is commitments to climate justice and just transition. So, these are really key principles for us as we're designing the cap and invest program, and actually requirements that are written directly into the law. I want to spend a little bit of time on our greenhouse gas emission reduction requirements in New York State. So, as I'm sure you all are familiar with, we went through a inventory process. So the Climate Act required DEC, the Department of Environmental Conservation, to prepare an annual statewide greenhouse gas emission report. And that really covers all sources in the state. And I do want to emphasize one of the unique features of the Climate Act, maybe as compared to some other state statutes addressing climate change, and that is that when we're talking about statewide greenhouse gas emissions for New York State, we are counting emissions that come into the state that are associated with like imported fossil fuel or electricity. So to the extent we're taking, for example, natural gas from the state of, or the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, and obviously that has upstream emissions associated with it in terms of the production and the transportation of that natural gas into New York State that's ultimately consumed in our state. Those emissions are accounted for under our Climate Act. And that's part of what we have to get at reducing under the Cap and Invest program. So just wanted to emphasize that. So, we issue an annual report. Our most recent one was back in December of 2022, looking at emissions data up through 2020. And so for us, it helped us to get a better sense. We already knew this to a large extent, but it gave us a better sense of the relative contribution of each of the sectors of greenhouse gas emissions, what's represented by the electric power sector, the transportation sector, the building sector, and so on. It also helped to give us the actual numbers in terms of millions of metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalents that we have to achieve. And so looking at that bar chart on the right, those are, so in 1990, we looked back in time and we kind of estimated that was roughly 400 million metric tons in New York State. Again, that's under the accounting that we have in the Climate Act. So that means we're accounting for upstream emissions. We also, another notable distinction, we also use a global warming potential of 20 instead of 100 years, which changes some of this metric. So that's another thing for you all to keep in mind. So we look back in time, we estimated 1990 emissions at about 400 million metric tons. We had made some, but clearly not enough progress from 1990 to 2019. And then we took those percentage reduction requirements that I mentioned that are in the statute, the 40% by 2030 and 85% by 2050, and we translated that to those numerical ton limitations. So on the right-hand side of the screen, those last two bars for 2030 and 2050, that's roughly 246 million metric tons for 2030 and 62 million metric tons carbon dioxide equivalent for 2050. So those are the emission limits that are set in the law, that we've established in regulation already, and that now we have to ensure that we will actually achieve through the implementation of the Cap and Invest program. By the way, we'll probably refer to that program as NICI, just for a shorthand, New York Cap and Invest NYCI. We refer to it as NICI just to, taking some inspiration from Reggie perhaps in terms of acronyms. But so moving on, I want to again kind of go back in history, kind of how we got here. How did we get to the point where New York State is developing an economy-wide Cap and Invest program, or NICI? So similar to what you are all going through, we had a Climate Action Council that was also established under this Climate Act, which included a mix of representatives from the administration, as well as legislative appointments and outside representatives. That council went through a 3-year process, including a draft scoping plan that was out for public comment at the end of 2021, and then a final scoping plan at the end of 2022. It's like 400 pages if you want to read through it. It's very I'm not being sarcastic, exciting reading material to see some of the recommendations that are in that. So as I mentioned at the beginning, there's a series of sector-specific strategies that are recommended in that scoping plan, legislative recommendations, regulatory recommendations, and so on. But in addition to all of those, which are of course complementary policies, the scoping plan also evaluated the potential for economy-wide. I guess maybe in your parlance that would be cross-sector strategies, right? So the final scoping plan, and that is available online on climate.ny.gov. There's a chapter in that scoping plan. It's chapter 17 of the scoping plan, and we can make sure you have that if you haven't seen it. But that has some qualitative discussion about economy-wide strategies. So it is worth looking at to give yourself some context for kind of the background and the criteria that the council used in New York to evaluate different types of economy-wide strategies. So for example, we considered a Cap and Invest program. We also considered an economy-wide carbon tax, right? So those are two of the primary, as you are all familiar with, I'm sure, types of economy-wide strategies that the scoping plan went through, evaluated, ultimately came out with the recommendation that it would be a Cap and Invest program that would be the best way of ensuring that we meet those emission limits set forth in the law, and also help to achieve some other key principles and requirements in the law, including about disadvantaged communities and equity, and environmental justice. So that was at the end of 2022 when the final scoping plan came out with this recommendation. Just a month later, so now we're up to January of 2023, the Governor Hochul, directed us at DEC and our colleagues at NYSERDA, New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. The governor directed DEC and NYSERDA to actually establish this program consistent with those recommendations from the Climate Action Council. So as I'll also mention briefly in a minute, there's also the state budget that New York passed back in May. Our annual state budget also included some provisions that help to further advance this program. So now Now it's on us, DEC and NYSERDA, to develop this program and to make sure that we're meeting those greenhouse gas emission reduction requirements. So when the governor did announce the Cap and Invest program back in January of 2023, she laid out several key principles for us, for DEC and NYSERDA, as we develop the mechanics and the details of the NICI program. So, you know, one of the most important ones is for us is affordability. We want to make sure that as we reduce emissions, we're you know, protecting against energy affordability, particularly for those that, you know, that is most burdensome for. And so that is why under this program, we intend to obviously collect proceeds through the auction of emission allowances. Our plan is to, and this has been confirmed by the state legislature, our plan is to basically set aside roughly a third of those funds to go directly back to New Yorkers. So individuals, consumers will get money back from this program, you know, roughly a third of the proceeds that ultimately come in. 2/3 will go to, you know, more traditional emission reduction initiatives to kind of further reduce emissions. But in addition to affordability, other key principles that the governor laid out for us have to do with making sure that we're preserving economic competitiveness, that we are investing in disadvantaged communities. That's a requirement in the law and an important principle. So all the money that comes in, at least 35% has to benefit disadvantaged communities, which is the term that we use under the Climate Act for basically environmental justice type of communities. But I think, you know, most important for this group and for this conversation is the one that's highlighted, and that is, of course, climate leadership or linking, right? And so the idea here is that we do want to be encouraging other states like Vermont to be joining with us in this program. And as we are designing this program, one of the key considerations for us, and again, key part of this conversation today, is to make sure that we're designing it with thoughts in mind from other states so that we're kind of facilitating that possibility of linking in the future. So moving on here to the next slide. So with those principles in mind, really the primary purpose of our program is to ensure that we meet the statewide greenhouse gas emission limits, you know, the 40% by 2030 and the 85% by 2050. So looking at this chart here, it kind of just gives you a sense in an illustrative manner, it's nothing's decided here, of what the downward slope of our emissions cap is going to look like. So we do know the endpoints. We know the 2030 and the 2050. That has to be 40% and 85%, and those numbers that I gave before, so roughly 62 million metric tons for 2050. That's what we have to get to. So that's been decided for us already by the statute, by the Climate Act. What we haven't decided yet is kind of the exact starting point and kind of what that trajectory, what the slope of that path looks like to get from here to there. That's something that's still under consideration as part of this stakeholder process. So, you know, this is just kind of a graphical description that hopefully kind of summarizes everything that I just described. And, you know, I'm sure most of you are familiar with how Cap and Invest programs work in general, whether that's through the RGGI program or otherwise, just with your familiarity with following other jurisdictions in the climate change space. But, you know, just to quickly summarize, obviously, a key feature of the program is that we would be setting an enforceable, legally enforceable limit on greenhouse gas emissions. That's the cap. So the annual amount of greenhouse gas emissions emitted each year in the state will go down to make sure that we meet the emission limits. A key feature of the program is going to be the legal requirement that large sources of greenhouse gas emissions will have to purchase or obtain emission allowances for each ton of their greenhouse gas emissions associated with their activities. So that's the way that these sources will have to ultimately comply with the program. So at the end of a relevant time period, sources will have to provide to DEC emission allowances to cover their emissions. Once those allowances are provided to us, for compliance purposes, they're permanently retired, and so they can never again be utilized by a source to cover emissions. And because that amount goes down, that's how we have that legal assurance that we meet the emissions cap, the emissions limit. And of course, the third key point is that most of these emission allowances will be sold through auctions, not necessarily 100%, but the vast majority will be. And so that will generate substantial allowance proceeds for the state, which again will then be set aside, roughly 1/3 to go back to New Yorkers to address affordability, and roughly 2/3 for other emission reduction purposes. Another part I should mention of the state budget that was passed back in May is calling for a climate affordability study process. So that's going to be looking at, and that's due by the end of this year, 2023. That's going to be looking at what's the best way to take this 1/3 of funds and get it back in the hands of New Yorkers, rebates, tax credits, like what's the best mechanism. So that's a process that's also kind of going on in parallel along with our regulatory process. And then I guess finally, again, just to reiterate, it's going to be key for us to make sure that we're prioritizing emission reductions in disadvantaged communities and making sure that we're recognizing longstanding environmental injustice. So I want to get a little bit more into some of the nitty-gritty regulatory mechanics of our program, kind of how we intend it to work. One part is having to do with greenhouse gas emission reporting. So in New York right now, we do not, unfortunately, have a comprehensive mandatory greenhouse gas reporting program. We have, we get emissions reported from big Title V emission sources and other entities and some information for EPA. But while we have that overall statewide inventory I mentioned that gives us a sense of emissions statewide, we don't necessarily have that specific information by individual sources. And so one part of our Cap and Invest program is going to be a mandatory reporting requirement. We would expect that the amount of sources and the universe of sources that are required to report information to us under this is going to probably be bigger than who has to provide emission allowances to us. So that we think that's going to help us to kind of get a better sense of the individual sources of emissions in the state and to help identify maybe potential future regulatory actions. So to implement this program, we are working on 3 parallel regulations. One is the actual, one is the mandatory greenhouse gas reporting program. That's going to be a DEC regulation. The second will be the actual nuts and bolts of the Cap and Invest program in terms of requirements for obtaining allowances and so on. That's another DEC regulation. And the third will be NYSERDA's auction regulation, which will address rules for participating in the allowance market and how the auctions are going to work. So it's going to be a package of 3 regulations that will, taken together, ensure that we meet the emission limits and that we promulgate regulations to make that enforceable, which is a requirement for us at DEC under the Climate Act. So before we get to some questions, I want to spend a few more minutes just talking about a couple of key distinguishing elements in the NICI program, New York Cap and Invest, as compared to maybe similar programs in other jurisdictions. One of the key ones is this concept that we refer to as obligated and non-obligated sources or emissions. So other jurisdictions, right, like California, Washington, have established Cap and Invest programs to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but ours is likely to be similar but not identical to those types of programs. And so this concept of obligated and non-obligated is a really important one. So we intend for this program to be truly economy-wide. That means that it would actually cover all of those tons of emissions I showed before, including emissions that are associated with imported fossil fuel and electricity. But we know that as a practical matter, we couldn't possibly impose a allowance compliance obligation on every ton of emissions. Some sources might be too small. Some sources might be things that maybe we are preempted by the federal government from regulating or have other challenges, right? So that's why we've created this concept of obligated and non-obligated sources. The concept here is that obligated emissions and sources would have to surrender allowances for their emissions, but non-obligated emission sources or sectors would not. And that the amount of emissions associated with those sources, we would account for those, and then we would retire that amount of allowances from the system. And overall, that would give us the assurance that we're covering all emissions under the Climate Act, but not actually obligating all of those emissions in terms of allowance requirement. So I'm going to walk through just a few graphics that hopefully illustrate this concept a little bit further, because it can be kind of confusing and is somewhat unique. And I think it is important to talk about because it's really one of the key parts of our program. So first, we're providing some examples here, right? So emissions that are associated with aviation, emissions that are like direct from livestock, or maybe very small individual sources of emissions. These are the types of potential categories that we would expect to not have to have an allowance compliance obligation. These are illustrative only because, again, we haven't made any final decisions, so as I emphasized. But, just as an example, an individual homeowner or renter would not be expected to have a compliance obligation, but we would expect that we would get at the majority of those emissions through placing a compliance obligation further upstream on a fuel supplier. So as we've emphasized, all emissions from all sources economy-wide under the Climate Act, that goes into the starting cap. That includes emissions that are associated with like bigger obligated sources, as well as ones that are associated with these non-obligated sources. So it all goes into the starting cap. And then non-obligated sources, as the name suggests, would not have an allowance compliance obligation, but they might have a mandatory reporting obligation, but not an allowance compliance obligation. But each year we would be setting aside this bin of allowances in an amount that covers those emissions. And then, as indicated by that red X, those allowances are permanently retired and are never available to obligated sources. And so this hopefully, summarizes this concept a little bit. So we would be first determining the annual allowance budget, the maximum amount of emission allowances that are available. Then we would issue a number of allowances equal to the emissions cap. So that's step one at the top of the screen. We would secondly go and identify the amount of emissions that are associated with non-obligated sources or non-obligated sectors. So that would be the bin of allowances to cover non-obligated emissions on the bottom right. And then this would be permanently retired and not available to obligated sources. So after that subtraction of allowances, only the remaining quantity of allowances, the bottom left bin, would be available to obligated sectors for distribution by auction or otherwise. So, the exact process for this still has to be worked out, but this is the basic concept here. And it's a way for us to ensure that we meet the Climate Act requirements without actually placing an allowance compliance obligation on every single ton of emissions. So we can get to that in more detail if you have questions later. But just briefly, another key thing that I wanted to make sure I emphasized again is the principle of making sure that we're benefiting disadvantaged communities. This is a requirement under the Climate Act that at least 35% of the funds, with the goal of really 40% or more, be targeted to benefit disadvantaged communities. But in addition to the investment side of the Cap and Invest program, we are also looking at potential ways to address and ensure emission reductions in disadvantaged communities on the so-called CAP side of the program. So that includes things like perhaps requiring additional allowances for sources that are located in disadvantaged communities, or perhaps requiring, having some limitations on the trading of emission allowances. So those are some of the things that we're thinking through. Obviously, we emphasized before that we think that we're going to be doing this type of program the best and maybe better than anybody has done it before, but we recognize that we're not the first. And so we are looking at other existing regulations, including from CARB, the California Air Resources Board, just as starting points to help inform our process. So we are seeking comments on those particular provisions as well. And then in terms of, so what are kind of the universe of decisions that we have before us? We have a number of these types of program decisions that are under development. I'm just going to briefly go through some of these that we have to work out through the regulatory process. So the first being applicability and thresholds, which is going to define who and under what emissions or operational circumstances the regulations would apply. So, this might be a different universe for mandatory reporters, might be a bigger universe for those, and then a smaller universe for entities that are obligated to provide us emission allowances. Then we have provisions that will have to address allowance allocation and identify how we create allowances and auction those to the system. Of course, one of the most important things is the cap and the allowance budget. So again, that's where we know the 2030 and the 2050 points, but we don't know sort of that path that we're going to take to get there. Another key item is program stability mechanisms. So that includes things that we have in the RGGI program, like the CCR, Cost Containment Reserve, and the ECR, Emissions Containment Reserve, and things that help to ensure some amount of stability in allowance price and emission reductions based on unanticipated events. And then things like compliance and enforcement and reporting and verification. So with that overview, and before we just get into questions, obviously, we're here today in large part because we do welcome continued dialogue and engagement with Vermont as we design this NICI program. In that spirit, we would love to have the state of Vermont serve as observers of our program development process. we'd be happy to talk about that in more detail with, Megan or other appropriate representatives of the state. And, really our objectives are to make sure that we as a state are meeting the requirements of the Climate Act, doing it in a manner consistent with the principles that the governor outlined for us. But, keeping in mind that one of those key principles is allowing for linking. So for purposes of this conversation, our goal at this stage really includes making sure that we are not foreclosing any possibilities for linking. We want to make sure that we design the program in a manner that facilitates the potential for states like Vermont and other jurisdictions to join us in this effort if possible. We want to make sure that we design it in a way that enables that possibility should Vermont ultimately decide to join us in this effort. So if you do have like specific ideas for how that engagement process should work, just let us know. And then finally, just like all stakeholders, you are encouraged to follow along on our process. Here's some of the websites, as I mentioned, capitinvest.ny.gov. You can follow. That will include this next phase of stakeholder outreach that we hope to hold in the fall. I should also mention that there are third parties that are holding various learning sessions and public informational opportunities about the New York program. That includes a group headed by Georgetown Climate Center and Resources for the Future and the Sabin Center at Columbia Law School that have held a couple of sessions the last couple of weeks. One was focused on California's program, one was focused on Washington's program. Those are publicly available on Georgetown Climate Center website. There will be another one next week that focuses on program stability and adjustment. So that's another way you can kind of follow along with what the third parties are talking about with our program over the course of the summer. So that was the quick overview, maybe not as quick as I would have liked it to be, but hopefully that's a helpful background, and I think we can just maybe go right into questions once I stop sharing my screen.
That was terrific. Thank you very much. And of course, you raised you touched on a host of really important topics, and therefore there could be numerous questions. I'd like to begin with questions and comments, observations from members of the committee. Let's take them in order, Bram. And then Jared and Jeannie.
Great, thank you. So first of all, thanks very much to the team from New York for your time today. Super appreciate it. And I have a bunch of questions, some of which I will defer until after other people have had a chance, and some of which I will try to edit. So the first question is, if you, and you touched on this briefly, but if you expand to other jurisdictions, say Vermont, does that mean there'll be sort of one common pool of emissions and one reduction goal? And if so, do you then stop caring whether New York hits its goals as long as the expanded jurisdiction hits its overall goals?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think the answer is not necessarily. I think ultimately, as a state, we do have to ensure that we meet our state emission limit, but we would also want to be ensuring that we're achieving the collective target, if that's the way that it gets. So I think there's a number of different ways that could work out, and I recognize, this is not a totally satisfying answer to your question, but I guess the short answer is ultimately we still have to meet our state target as a state of New York. But there's different ways that could work, I think, that we can all talk through collectively with you all in Vermont and other states to sort of see how that might work regionally. I'll give one example that we are familiar with, which is Massachusetts. Massachusetts has, of course, the regional RGGI program that they participate in, but they also had a court tell them that that wasn't enough in and of itself to ensure that they're meeting their state target. And so they have their RGGI program, and then overlaid on top of it for the electric sector, they have a Massachusetts backup program, kind of. So a source is required to make sure that they have allowances to comply with RGGI, but then if necessary, also comply with like a state-specific overlay program. So that's just one example of a way that it could conceivably work, where a state can be sure that it's meeting both the regional target and the state-specific target.
Got it, thanks. And I will just ask one other of my many questions, if I may, which is, could Vermont join just for a particular sector? And in particular, could we join just for the transportation sector without touching the other sectors in Vermont, which we have solutions for.
Yeah, I mean, this is a question that I think I was expecting was coming, so I'm not surprised by it. But I think the answer is maybe, right? And again, recognizing maybe the unsatisfactory nature of some incomplete answers. It's just the reality of where we're at. So if the desire of Vermont or any other state is to link for purposes of only one or a subset of sectors, that's something that we'd like to know, and we would try to think of ways that we could design our program to accommodate that. I don't have the perfect solution to that right now at the top of my head, but I recognize the fact that it's a likelihood. And so if we're meeting the governor's principle of making sure that we're facilitating linking, I think that means that we have to allow for that possibility. But exactly how to do that when we know we are going to be economy-wide, because we have to be under the statute that we have, that'll be something that we'll have to work through. So I don't know. I should say that Mike Sheehan and Lois New can feel free to chime in with any additional context here if they'd like.
Great, thank you.
Jared and then Gina.
Thanks, Rich. And thank you again, John, for the really helpful and informative presentation and for the whole team being here. Before we talk about, or before I ask about the Cap and Invest program, I want to ask just kind of a starting point question that's kind of got two parts. One is this kind of interplay between, or like kind of the balance and trade-offs between taking a totally economy-wide approach and really not worrying as much about where the emissions reductions come from by sector, as long as the overall targets are met, versus having more of a sector-specific approach. And clearly those are not mutually exclusive. Clearly there is a benefit to complementary policies. But my starting point question is whether your Climate Act has any sectoral requirements or targets. I'm going to put in the chat so others can see it, and I'll just read it. Our Global Warming Solutions Act in Vermont, which is the equivalent of your Climate Act, calls for providing greenhouse gas emissions reductions reflecting the relative contribution of each source or category of source of emissions. So I think we've had an eye to meeting the overall obligations that are in the law, but also making sure that we have an eye to this guidance as well. I would just reflect that one of the things that's really appealing to me about economy-wide cap and invest is it allows for greater efficiency and cost effectiveness with appropriate guardrails around equity and disadvantaged communities. But I also know that you guys have, my understanding is that you've been looking at complementary policies that would be more sector specific. For instance, performance, I think you've considered performance standards like what are sometimes called clean fuel standards or low carbon fuel standards. I'm just wondering if you can talk about that interplay between overall targets and requirements versus sector by sector, and how this economy-wide policy you envision interplaying with ones that may have more of a sector-specific focus.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think sort of the short answer to your initial question is we're not required under the law to have sector-specific targets. We have the economy-wide target, and that's obviously what the Cap and Invest program is intended to achieve. But you're also correct, of course, that there's going to be a whole series of complementary policies. And one of the benefits of a Cap and Invest program is that it can work in tandem with all of those complementary policies so that we can do both at the same time. So we do have various sector-specific emission reduction regulations already in place, and those will continue. Whether that's the RGGI program, right? Our participation in that for the power sector, all the various California car-related regulations that we've adopted, including Advanced Clean Cars 2, for example, and Advanced Clean Trucks for the transportation sector. So things like that are already in place and will continue to reduce emissions in those sectors. We already have in place, as another example, hydrofluorocarbon HFC regulations to help address the phase out of those compounds. And we will be working on an update to that regulation as well. We're also working on, just as one more example, an SF6 sulfur hexafluoride regulation to get at those emissions from the electric transmission sector. So we're going to continue to do those types of specific sector regulations, but and that's all great. But at the same time, we feel that we also need this complementary overlay to, again, ensure that we meet the overall limit. But it also is the best mechanism in our minds, as you alluded to, because it does take into account those other programs. So the fact that the CARS regulations are reducing emissions from the transportation sector, that gets accounted for automatically in the Cap and Invest program because those emissions are being reduced, and then allowance prices are adjusted accordingly automatically by the market. So I hope that answers your question to some extent. So, you know, again, the legal answer is we're not required to do sector-specific limits, but the practical answer is we're doing both because we think these types of programs work in tandem very well.
Thank you.
Gina?
Yeah, thanks. This is so informative. I'm interested in knowing how much resources have you been spending on doing your work to date? We have looking at Cap and Invest in our climate plan, but we're having a hard time rallying the resources to actually dig into what you're describing is a ton of work. So it sounds like your legislature has been very generous with you and the governor is allowing you to budget this, but how much money are you spending roughly to get to this policy?
Yeah, it's another really good question. I don't think I can give you, I just don't have a dollar figure to give you right here today, but I guess I'll make a few points. One is the fact of the matter is our team at DEC is wonderful, but too small, right? So we don't have enough staff engaged in this effort. We're working on building it, as you mentioned. As part of that state budget, the DEC has received, you know, some additional allotment of staff, but you know that process takes time to hire people and to find qualified folks to work on these types of programs. So that's something that we're still working on. Our agency is, you know, not at the levels that it had been even 15, 20 years ago when we really had a lot less work to do in terms of this kind of stuff, right? So we're doing it under limited, we're resource constrained in terms of staff. We also have, of course, though, besides DEC, there are our colleagues at the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, so we're relying very heavily on those folks. But if you ask other states like California or Washington that have established these programs, how many staff they have engaged in the program development and program implementation and enforcement, it's always much higher than what we have in New York. And so we are very cognizant of that on a day-by-day basis. So, you know, we could work to get you more specific numbers of staff or dollar values if that's helpful. But I think you're right to be concerned about that. But I think as people that work for states and state agencies, we're sort of used to being resource constrained and trying to do as much as we can with the limited resources that we have. So we haven't let that, I guess the last point I'll make is like the schedule that we're on for this type of program, even if we had, you know, an army of hundreds of staff engaged in this, is like really aggressive, right? So the climate, I don't think I mentioned that the Climate Act actually has in statute that the DEC is supposed to have this program in place by the end of 2023. That's a very aggressive and, you know, virtually impossible deadline for us to meet. So we're working towards that as much as we can, but, you know, we want to make sure we get it right. And in order to get it right with our unlimited staff, you know, we might not make that deadline. So, yeah, and I saw, you know, Megan's chat, like, right. So there's, if you look at some of the other states, they've had dozens or, you know, 50 or 100 staff just on this program, but we certainly don't have that, unfortunately, but we're working to build it.
Well, it seems as though if we're going to go forward, we're going to need resources, and we'll have to work with our governor and legislative body on that. And are there grants or other programs that you're relying on?
I mean, I think there's a lot of money that's available right now from the federal government, including EPA, for example, like EPA's Climate Pollution Reduction Grant Program, which I imagine Vermont is already participating in. Yeah. And so I think something like that is a potential area that you could, you know, rely on some resources from the feds. I think this would fit well within that.
I have one more question, and then I will give the talking stick to someone else. I guess Andrea from VTrans is here. They're probably going crazy right now with the flood, but I'm curious to know where New York DOT, are they part of this, and have they raised issues, and what are those issues vis-a-vis their funding stream or anything else?
Yeah, good question. So DOT was one of the agencies engaged in the Climate Action Council planning process that we went through. So DOT, up to their agency head, was involved in the council and part of that process that led to the recommendation for a cap and invest program. So they're involved to that extent. They're not doing the regulations that we are doing. It's going to be DEC and NYSERDA that are actually implementing the program, but we are certainly closely coordinated with DOT. We've obviously heard, just like a lot of DOTs have said, that one of their concerns as we get off fossil fuels, as we're trying to do in the transportation sector, is how that affects their sources of income. So that's definitely a point of conversation. Obviously, one of the points of this program is that it does generate allowance revenue that can be used for a variety of purposes. So that's something else that's being discussed as we develop the program.
Thank you.
So I'll join the others in thanking you again for a great presentation and thoughtful answers to the questions. So I've got two questions. The first has to do with obligated parties and the second, market barriers. So obligated parties, you mentioned you're trying to go relatively high in the chain of commerce. Can you give us any insights on who you think the obligated parties would be in the fuels sectors? And are you I assume you're including manufacturing, and how big do you have to be as a commercial emitter in order to trigger an obligation to be covered?
Yeah, so on the stationary source side, we're looking at the existing thresholds that exist in various programs. 25,000 tons is probably the most common threshold that is out there. So that's something that we're considering. We are keeping in mind that different accounting that we have currently under our Climate Act as compared to most other jurisdictions. That's the 20-year GWP, global warming potential. So that kind of affects this conversation a bit. On the fuel side, we are looking a lot and borrowing a lot from the thinking that went into the Transportation and Climate Initiative process, recognizing how that process ended up. There was a lot of thinking there that kind of went into what is the point of regulation in the fuel supply chain. And so I think we're kind of using that as a starting point to a large extent, but we do expect that it would be, the providers or the distributors of the fuel that would have the allowance compliance obligation, not the consumers or the end users themselves. But maybe this is an area where Mike Sheehan might want to add some detail if you're available.
Yeah, John, I would just say from a reporting perspective, we're probably going to go very low, given the way our fuel system, the imports and exports, the numerous borders from where fuel comes into and exits the state. I think we're still assessing the threshold at which we would capture the majority of those fuels. And it may end up being a little bit lower. I know Quebec had a number of issues when they launched their program, and actually they get reporting almost down to 0 gallons. So there's a lot we're assessing right now to determine, and obviously it impacts all of our fuels. So we have the same issue with home heating fuels.
Right. Well, and you also have a jurisdictional question, like how high up can you go? Anyway, so the business in the low carbon fuel standards of looking at the point of importation, for example, we have been dealing with that in Vermont as well.
Yeah,
my question, I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, Exxon came in and did a presentation that at the rack, there's actually 3 owners: the owner on the upside of the rack, the owner at the on the truck, and then there's a transactional owner in between. So it's pretty complicated.
Got it. Yes, we've been learning about that ourselves. My question about market barriers deals with, I think, a question that Jared raised about one sector or multiple sectors inside a cap and invest or cap and trade program. The European decision makers who were considering revising the European trading system, we're struggling with the following question, that the elasticities of demand in different sectors are quite different. And that particularly in the building sector, there's a pretty high or pretty low elasticity of demand. And so price alone isn't a very good driver of the investments needed in the building sector to reduce emissions. So there was a long conversation about segmenting the trading system so that the barriers to change in the building sector weren't going to drive up the cost of carbon allowances too much to manufacturing or to power sector. And there's also then, of course, the transportation sector to consider. So I guess my question is, have you considered, or are you, have you had studies done to consider the best way to address that problem in your, single cap approach? Or do you just decide, well, we're going to solve it with complementary policies, and with the way we distribute the money?
Yeah, so we've certainly considered that issue. We're not currently planning to segment, as you indicated, right? We are intending for it to be one big system. I think our thinking is that even if it does have some, I guess you're kind of implying that maybe there's some sectors that are winners and losers, so to speak, under this type of system. And I think our feeling is that the overall cost of the program is still lower if we have it be multiple sectors without segmenting. And then, yeah, to answer your question more explicitly, yes, we think that through complementary policies and the use of funds, that's the primary way to get at that concern. The other way is through what we call emissions or energy intensive and trade exposed industries, EITE. And so, to use your example of manufacturing, to the extent we're concerned about costs that are imposed on that sector, and we don't want to see certain economic activity leave the state, we would expect that sources that qualify as EITE sources could receive allowances directly from the state and not have to pay the cost of allowances. So that's how, I was mentioning the vast majority of allowances we would intend to auction, but we would expect that some sources would qualify as EITE, in part to address this concern that you're highlighting, and would receive allowances, from the state directly. The other way to address that concern. I
Thank
think
you.
we probably have time for a couple more questions. So yeah, before we wrap up.
Go for it, Bram and Joey.
I've already asked, so Joey, you should go first.
Thanks, Bram, and thank you to the New York team for your good work and your time today. It's exciting. One question I have is, how are you thinking you'll be able to make cuts in the non-obligated sector?
Good question. So I think that's largely through complementary policies, whether that's regulations or investments, right? So looking at the overall scoping plan that I mentioned, all of those non-obligated sectors or sources, there's still various strategies for how do we reduce emissions from those sectors. That's still going to be happening. So, for example, maybe if we ultimately decide that we're not going to be obligating these HFC emissions, we would still be having a compliance obligation on the direct regulation side for that source of emissions, just not under the Cap and Invest program. So the fact that they're not obligated under the Cap and Invest program doesn't mean that they don't have some regulatory requirement. And if they don't, then they might have a investment program that's targeted to reduce those emissions.
Thanks. All right, Bram, I have another question, but I'll defer to you and maybe follow up another time. Thank you.
All right, so on the subject of sector-specific reductions, I believe there was a slide in which you identified getting the electric generating sector to zero emissions as a goal.
That's a requirement in the law, right? So even though I said before in response to, I think it was Jared's question. Yeah, there's no sector-specific limits. I guess the exception to that, as you're pointing out, is the electricity sector. does have a zero emission by 2040 requirement.
And do you know off the top of your head what counts as zero emissions? Which kinds of generation?
I'm laughing because no, I don't know off the top of my head because the New York State has not answered that question. That's an open proceeding before our Public Service Commission. So I talked a lot about DEC and NYSERDA, which are doing the Cap and Invest program, but our Public Service Commission also has a role under the Climate Act, including this requirement for zero emissions electricity sector by 2040. And they have an open proceeding right now where they're soliciting comments on just that exact question.
Got it. Thank
But I
you.
don't know the answer. I don't know the answer because we don't know the answer yet.
Yeah.
So things like, renewable natural gas, biomass, all that kind of stuff is still, I think, a question mark.
All right, thanks very much. I understand that you all have another obligation at this hour, so I want you to feel free to depart if you need to.
Yeah, Mike and I do have to drop, but this has been a really great conversation. You all are asking really great questions, which is no surprise because it shows how much thought you've all put into this. So I appreciate that. And thanks again to Megan and the team for inviting us. We're happy to have had the conversation. We hope it's just the first of many because we do want to continue this type of engagement. So thanks very much. Hope to talk to you all soon.
Well, thanks to you all. It's really terrific to hear from you.
Yeah, thanks so much,
Appreciate
John.
it.
Thanks, Mike. Take care.
Take care. Talk to you soon.
Thanks, guys. Really appreciate it.
Okay, then, committee, we have a few moments here to engage in some discussion, if you'd like to, and then we can take public comments. Any thoughts about what we might want to do as a committee with respect to following up on this presentation? Gina?
What do we do next? I mean, I think we need to go to the council and brief them on this and then put some resources towards following up. Is that too wild and crazy? And that seems like a logical first step. Letting the council know this is going on. It seems like a big deal to me. Letting the council know what's going on and getting their, for lack of a better word, blessing to further work with them.
Thanks.
Am I jumping ahead?
I
think this is the conversation that we need to have. TJ and then Liz.
Yeah, Gina, I think that is a good instinct to want to kind of elevate the discussion. I think it would be most useful if there was some of that. I think it was you that asked the question of what are the resources that New York is allocating, right? If before getting the blessing of the council to kind of understand and actually follow up on that with New York and say, well, what really is this, and what do we think type of resources would be needed? What kind of analysis might we need to kind of to explore this better? And or are we already doing some of that in the carbon reduction strategy type of, and maybe we don't, but just kind of putting it together, not just kind of saying, hey, New York's doing this, we kind of want to do it too. And then we get into a situation where we've been in where the council like half blesses like moving forward without a real goal or process or target in mind. So I think I'm supporting what you're saying, but with some more information and background.
Exactly, TJ. I think you stated it very well.
Liz?
Yeah, I'm probably just going to add a little flourish on what Gina was just saying. Then it feels like hearing from, the state agencies directly involved, the climate office, on what, if any, interaction or participation they were already planning would probably be good, or maybe even AOT, right? So that we can target any additional participation accordingly, as a part of presenting that information to the Climate Council. That would be an important thing to understand.
Megan?
Yeah, thanks, Liz. I can talk about that a little bit. So I think I just want to clarify what I think I heard John say in his discussion. What he was referring to, other jurisdictions being invited to participate as observers. And I think that there's different levels of what there are different definitions of what that could mean. It could certainly mean that it's a pretty informal status and we just continue to follow what's publicly available in terms of the program development and design. And when, whenever they get around to proposing their various rules, obviously we would provide input on that through their formal process. And I guess I just want to reflect on the process that ANR and other state agencies, including VTrans and Public Service, participated in when we were working on the Transportation Climate Initiative program with the other jurisdictions, because I think that that is an example of how we participated previously in development of a cap and invest program. Obviously, the initiative hasn't succeeded, but it's, I would say that you could call all of the jurisdictions that were participating in that program development observers, but we were, kind of observing each other in a much more coordinated fashion. First of all, the program development was facilitated and funded by the Georgetown Climate Center. They had funders that were putting significant resources into facilitating the conversation and standing up the various working groups. And there were many that were required to develop a robust and thoughtful program. And we had, legal agreements in place with the other states to be able to share information and keep information confidential. We had coordinated discussions about how we wanted to model the different scenarios. That modeling again was funded by Georgetown. So that's a level of involvement and coordination that I think is probably obviously on the very other end of the spectrum from what would just a kind of informal observer would be here. But I think that things to think about in this subcommittee is, what does observer mean in this particular situation, given that obviously this is an initiative being led by a jurisdiction. It's not being facilitated by a regional organization like Georgetown that has independent funding. But, are there opportunities for jurisdictions to work more closely with New York, for example, to have discussions about modeling, to have discussions about program designs, to have discussion about how and if certain sectors are covered and to what extent and what that looks like. So I just offer that for informational purposes based on our experience within ANR, and I certainly welcome folks from VTrans or Public Service to weigh in on their roles and participations in the other programs that we've worked jointly to develop with other states. But that just, I think, hopefully will give the subcommittee an idea of how these programs can come together and the level of involvement that may or may not be an option.
Thanks, Megan. Jared?
Thanks, Megan, and everybody for the comments so far. I mean, part of what I'm thinking is that while this would be a multifaceted, multi-year process, if anything was going to happen in terms of linking, in order to preserve the opportunity for that to happen, it feels like that it would be wise, and I personally would recommend more of a formal observer status, so that when some of these key questions come up that would really impact Vermont's ability to participate in the program, that we're able to provide feedback. Because when the question of resources comes up, there is a way in which, if New York designs a program well that can accommodate Vermont, that would be much more cost and staff efficient as a potential path than us trying to design our own program. There are some things in this presentation that I thought were really encouraging. I mean, when John said that, 25,000 tons is the most common threshold in terms of emitting sources, in terms of obligated sources, and then Mike followed up saying that New York is likely to go lower. I mean, that is the type of thing. I mean, Megan, correct me if I'm wrong, but my recollection is that in the past, when we've looked at some of these programs from larger states or larger provinces, their thresholds are so high that it would be difficult for Vermont to participate, given the distributed nature of our fuel importation. And if New York, I don't know that that's the right answer there, but that struck me as a specific example where Vermont is likely going to have a perspective on what would work for us versus what would not, as a smaller state with unique circumstances, that if New York does want to preserve the opportunity to have other states regionally partnering in their program, they should formally know that as we go through. And the other thing I would mention on this point is that the degree to which we have to, the kind of staff levels that would be required to support a economy-wide cap and invest program are, I think, going to depend in large part the degree to which it has to be kind of developed out of whole cloth versus, what can be borrowed from other places. So for instance, we've seen some of the places that have joined the Western Climate Initiative be able to utilize the WCI auction platform, and that cost, both in terms of developing it and staffing it, it was something that was developed by the early leaders of that. So those are just a few examples of, I think in order to really be able to understand what the opportunities are, could it work for Vermont, and what would that look like from a staffing perspective, I feel like we need to have a closer seat at the table to make sure that it, or to at least be able to provide a voice that could preserve that opportunity, rather than seeing things go in a way that would potentially preclude our participation. We're not there to provide that input. And I would defer to the state agencies in terms of what that would look like in terms of observer status, in terms of who's participating. But I mean, that it felt like there was an invitation there, and I think it would be a missed opportunity not to take up that invitation to have observer status.
Thanks, Jared. What general observation based on the conversation that we also had with the New York team previously, my understanding of their invitation, at least at the moment, to other states to become observers is that that would be a decision at the highest levels in the state. That is, does your state want to be an observer, is not a decision that would be taken by any department head or any sub-state entity. What that would suggest is that if the Climate Council has an opinion on this as to whether Vermont should be an observer or not, that would be could be a recommendation of the Climate Council. But it's a decision that would have to be taken by the state of Vermont collectively, I guess you'd say, through the administration. And I think that's how New York intends to proceed. It sounds a lot closer to what Megan was describing as people participating in TCI rather officially at the state level. A different option would be for the state of Vermont or state agencies or the Climate Council to participate in an informal way, following the New York process, trying to pay attention to it, maybe giving some informal input to their process. And of course, a third option has always been for the state of Vermont to develop its own comprehensive cap and invest program, which so far we have not chosen to do. But I just wanted to offer that range of options just to facilitate this conversation. But I'm back to I guess it was Gina's initial observation echoed by Liz that at a minimum, our committee should report this conversation to the Climate Council. And it may be, in fact, that the entire Climate Council would want to hear a presentation like the one we just saw. I don't know if the whole council would want to hear all that, but certainly they should hear from us. Joey?
Yeah, I guess I just want to generally agree with what you just said, including affirming Liz and Gina's thoughts. It feels like there are some questions that we need to get answered that would be helpful. I think a potential recommendation either from cross-sector then to the council, whether they want to have a presentation, which I would certainly support, would be helpful. But it feels like there's an invitation to participate, but is there a table? And like, what is that? Like, I don't think there's clarity. You sort of made some, offered some thoughts on that, Rich, but I think we should ask that question more pointedly. And yes, maybe it's the administration who would facilitate that, but also potentially the council recommending that, and or the legislature creating a seat at the table, or requiring Vermont, enabling Vermont to participate in that conversation. But then it does come down to resources and capacity. So I think that was a very helpful presentation. I think I'd like to dig into it a little bit more, and there may be some follow-up questions that it would be helpful to get answered on process that potentially, Megan or the ANR team would be potentially willing to get answered to help us just understand what the opportunity actually is.
Yeah, one observation, just from history, is that in Reggie, there was an attempt at a commitment from the very beginning to collaboratively across the states to collaboratively develop a common proposal. And TCI, I think, is operated, with the same objective to create a common program. I think New York at the moment seems to be saying, we are going to create our program, and we are inviting others to participate with us, should you choose to, but we are going ahead. And that's just different from the way Reggie and TCI were developed. And you're right to ask the question, Joey, like, what does it mean to be an observer, and who's at the table and what's being decided? They do really want, and the governor of New York has made it clear to her agencies that they want to facilitate other states joining in a common effort. So even though they're committed to going ahead by themselves, they're also open to coordination of some kind. Totally undecided what that coordination, on their side, they don't know what that's going to look like. And are there going to be other states in our region who will say, yes, we will become official observers, and therefore it starts to, coalesce into something bigger than what it is right now. We just don't know. They don't know. Christine?
Yeah, I can understand why they're saying, we're moving forward and you're welcome to join us, because if they wait for the rest of us all to catch up, they'll never achieve what they're trying to achieve by the end of this year, and God bless them for taking that on. I strongly support the idea of having this presentation be made to the Vermont Climate Council. And the sooner the better, I would say. And then let the council talk among themselves, and hopefully there would be at least enough interest, and it would help prime the pump for a more specific recommendation coming up through this subcommittee process with more details of what participation could look like, rather than us talking at the council about what we've heard, and then waiting for them to maybe eventually listen to this work that's going on. But you, a bunch of you are on the council, so you know much better than I how to help things move properly through that piece of the ecosystem. But that's just my own gut instinct.
Thanks, Christine. Any other comments or questions from committee members? All right. Thanks very much. TJ, are you raising your hand?
I just was going to make a suggestion of, if the committee wants to, perhaps after hearing public comment, that it should formalize what it's going to do as next steps or the actions it's going to take, if it's a recommendation. So maybe we hear public comment first and come back to it, so that that decision can be informed.
Thank you. That's my intention. Members of the public who have comments at this point? I'm not seeing any on my screen. Are you seeing any, TJ?
Rob.
Oh, I see. Rob.
Yep.
Thank you. Rob.
Thanks, Rich, and thanks the subcommittee for having this discussion today. Knowing that you all had recommended us getting the state of Vermont getting involved with TCI, I think it's important for you to at least explore this conversation. So I'm hoping that you do make that recommendation to the larger climate council to take this up and answer some of those questions about how Vermont can be involved. So as a member of the public and working for the Sierra Club, I support that direction.
All right, thank you very much. We have a comment in the chat. Pike Porter's pointing out that, of course, this was recorded and the members of the Climate Council could be invited to look at it. That's a start. Further thoughts about our recommendation based on today's meeting. Joey?
Well, I'm certainly interested. I think Pike offers a very, that's helpful. So I'm conscientious of taking so much of their time, and like, when's the right moment to ask them to come back? It feels like I do sort of wonder if there are some questions that would be helpful for us to know before we ask them back, so that we make sure that either we're proactively answering those for the Climate Council, just doing a little bit more due diligence in and of our own accord before we ask the New York team to come back may be helpful. Because I definitely want to pursue this further. I'm just trying to think about best next steps, and I'm not really sure timing. I just was trying to look at the calendar to remind myself when the next Climate Council meeting is, when our next meeting is, like what, and then also thinking about how this conversation interrelates with the carbon reduction strategy. So while I am very eager and interested in exploring this further, I'm trying to just think about most efficient process and next steps for everyone. But maybe Liz has the answer, so take it away.
Liz.
Doubtful, but I was thinking that maybe the next steps could be, I'm pretty sure that our next Climate Council meeting will again have sort of report outs from each subcommittee in terms of what's happened since last we met as a council. So we could do 3 things. One would be to have as our report out highlighted, among other things we have done between then and now, that we had this presentation today, to link it to the whole council, the actual, PowerPoint, like include it in the Climate Council agenda, which happens to kind of raise it back up rather than having people have to go search for a specific email or link. And then we as a subcommittee could right now or at our next meeting decide to ask the Climate Office of ANR as coordinating body for the rest of the state agencies and departments that interact with this work, to just give us an update on what their current thinking is in terms of interacting with New York on this process, and any either direct action they're planning to take or recommendations they have for that action. That would give us something from the state agencies directly to then share with the Climate Council as a whole, and probably inform our own next steps, including, as Rob said in public comment, and the rest of us have said in other portions of this meeting, a recommendation by the Climate Council to directly participate to the extent New York will have us. So anyway, those are the three things. Put it on the agenda, give them the PowerPoint, and decide either today or soon to ask the Climate Office to actually give us a little, blurb, page long, whatever, half a page, on what state agencies are thinking they already should be doing or will be doing with New York on this.
Just want to jump in really quick there and follow up on what Liz was saying, and just offer that the Climate Office can raise that at our next interagency board meeting of the Climate Action Office, so that we can coordinate with our other state agencies and figure out how we want to keep informed and share information. So thanks, Liz. We'll do that.
Can I make one potential minor recommendation to that good list of suggestions and your willingness to do that, Megan, which is, could the Climate Office say what you could be doing, maybe not what you will be doing, because maybe those things are different. So I just wonder if I just want to make what realm of possibility, then temper that with reality, capacity, and other things.
So I think the answer to that, Joey, depends on more input from New York, because I think they need to be explicit with us in what they're offering in terms of how a jurisdiction could participate, not just Vermont, but anyone who's interested. And so we can try to follow up with New York to get more information about their intention there. Would that be helpful?
I think that'd be very helpful.
That's very helpful.
So
What did they mean? What did they mean when they said
right,
that's one of the priorities, is to have other entities join? What does that mean in terms of the planning for it? Are you guys going to do the whole thing and then invite us to participate, or do we have some active role? I mean, this is all going to go very fast for them. I mean, they probably won't have those details figured out by the end of the year, but they're going to have a lot of it figured out by the end of the year. So that's
and they may not be able to answer, right, like along those lines, Gina, they may not be able to answer that question. And we might have to give them time to do that, so that could be an answer, is we'll let you know.
yeah, I think that's
a betting
likely.
person. Yes, that's probably won't happen.
And also, I think what they might say back to us might depend on what they're hearing from other states as well about this same kind of question. So I'd like to boil this down to action points that we agree on. I think there's seems to be pretty strong agreement that we're asking the Climate Office to reach out to New York and ask that question and be able to report to the council what you hear back from them, or back to this committee. And second, what steps the administration is considering taking with respect to engagement with New York, or coordination of some kind with New York. So that's an action that we're asking from the Climate Office. And then second, we would like to make this a formal part of the Climate Council's next meeting, at least to the degree of linking the slides and the presentation today in the agenda and teeing it up for the full council at our September meeting.
I have maybe I'm opening a can of worms, but for this group, we're under a mandate to further this concept of cap and trade for transportation. And is what we're doing now it? Or are we supposed to be doing something else?
Well, that's why I asked.
Sorry for opening up a can of worms.
That's why I asked the New York delegation whether we could join just for transportation, and they don't know that yet. I do understand it's possible to join WCI on a sector by sector basis. And another question that I wish we had time to ask the New Yorkers is why they chose to set up their own statewide instead of joining WCI. Also, that would be valuable for us as we try to figure out what our next move is. But I think we have to do something with transportation. We know that cap and invest is one possible way to address it. And New York's program may be one potentially lower hurdle way to implement a cap and invest if that's what we decide to do in Vermont.
Thanks, Bram. That's a really great observation. And for what it's worth, I asked this question when we had a pre-meeting with that team, the New York team, and they said they were open to some kind of joint venture with WCI. They hadn't excluded it as a possibility. But this question of that you just raised, which is could we somehow collaborate with them just on transportation, I'm sure will be raised also by the council, and we need to keep that question alive. Jared?
Thanks, Rich. A couple of thoughts in response to Gina's question. I'll just offer my opinion that, I see this as one pathway to explore, but not, the only thing to lean on. I think we've seen, that a lot of these program and policy design efforts are complex and they can entail surprises. And I think that we need to be exploring as many options as possible to meet our legal obligations. And this is one. I will say that, I don't read our recommendation as, that we added as an addendum to the climate action plan as, a cap and invest program or a performance standard just for transportation. It would be that those are the two programs that have proven track records of reducing emissions, and that because we are currently lacking a mechanism to ensure reductions from the transportation sector, those are the two things that right now we can point to as solutions that should be pursued. But that to me does not mean that our involvement in a cap program should be limited to the transportation sector. I think that is an option to be aware of, sector-specific participation versus economy-wide, but we could certainly reduce emissions from the transportation sector with an economy-wide cap and invest program. So I want to be clear that I don't think our exploration of potential partnership with New York should be only limited to covering transportation sector emissions, but that it could be economy-wide as a complementary policy with everything else we're doing, which would be an emissions reduction mechanism for the transportation sector as well, but not exclusively. I think that we want to keep both of those options on the or explore what both of those would look like. But that's where my head is at.
Right. Thanks, Jared. I sense that we have a consensus on the committee to take those two action steps. And am open to any other suggestions, but I think those, Liz, you boiled it down nicely, and it looks like the committee agrees with you. And it may be that and I'll ask Christine. Christine, I think you graciously volunteered to be the minutes taker today. In which case, thank you. And do you have what you need? Okay. Any further business for the committee? All right. Anybody want to talk about the flood? I almost hate to bring it up, but I hope everybody's doing well and recovering as best as possible. I know a lot of people were really affected.
I hope the council looks at all the work that was done post-Irene, the resilience work that was done post-Irene, and what worked and what didn't. Millions and millions of dollars were spent all around the state, in Brandon and Brattleboro, on various strategies. Larger culverts is the easy one, but also all kinds of river projects. And did that save us? So that's just something I'm saying to those of you who are on the council. I think that would be some really important research to look at. Yeah,
I agree.
And, the only thing I'd say about the flooding is that we had flooding and a tornado and wildfire smoke all in the same few days. And I think we need to, as we go forward and design resilience into our communities, be aware that there are going to be multiple extreme weather events simultaneously of different sorts.
Yeah, the observation is a good one. Thank you. Anything further for the committee today? I think we're Christine and Joey.
I just think about so much talk about what the incremental cost of fossil fuels would be under a future clean heat standard, and think about the millions and millions and millions of dollars of cost resulting from this one storm event. And I just hope that we move quicker for those who have not yet connected those dots to connect those dots at the highest level of government in Vermont by tomorrow, please, 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 please. It's painful to experience the ongoing lack of connection in the absence of such obvious evidence. Thank you.
Thanks, Christine. Joey, and back to Brown.
Yeah, no, I agree. And it's painful cost-wise and just such devastation. As a Montpelier resident myself, it's just absolutely heartbreaking for our fabulous businesses and the cost and the consequence. One other thought, and maybe I can take this offline, but it's a very sensitive time, very intense time for a lot of people. People are pitching in as much as possible, which is always inspiring. And at the same time, there are a lot of places that probably are going to have to replace a lot of their infrastructure, heating systems, potentially, for example. And I'm just curious, and maybe this isn't the right venue, but just thinking about, as we work to help people get back on their feet, are there opportunities to help people not lock into some of the things that are exacerbating the problem, like fossil-fired heating equipment? If we need to replace something, being sensitive to people just need to not be stressed, but I just do wonder about this moment in time and trying to help people financially and logistically do that. So maybe it's a question for another venue, but I'm thinking about that a little bit, among the many things.
Yeah, thanks. Well, the same thing is true of people who are ripping out insulation. I mean, there's a lot of rebuilding that might be going on that we would hope would be accomplished in a very efficient and low emissions fashion. but the programs that we have in place are we hope are able to try to help with that. But certainly the council could encourage those programs to do the best job possible in the short time that this work is going to be underway. I mean, I've been in basements ripping out insulation and removing furnaces and what have you, and people are going to replace those things right away. Bram?
I would add just two observations. One is that traveling through the state post-flood, one cannot help but feel that we are vastly underestimating the cost of climate change. As it gets worse and more intense, that whatever dollar number we estimate, we can't possibly be foreseeing all the costs, and the dollar cost is going to be higher than however good our best forecast is. We're going to get it wrong, and it's going to be wrong on the low side, and it's going to be wrong on the low side by a lot. And the other is, and I'm sorry that I don't remember the person's name or affiliation, but someone who has worked on this said that even without climate change, going to zero fossil fuel will more than pay for itself simply in the human health cost savings of not using fossil fuels, which I had never heard before and struck me as a startling observation as to the incredible cost of the human health effects of fossil fuels. So multiple benefits on multiple axes as we wind down the use of fossil fuels.
Thanks, Brent. Thanks for those reflections. Anything further? Jared.
Just I'll offer, I put in the chat a piece that I thought was really timely and informative from the Washington Post. And I think a lot of us for a long time have thought that with extreme events that would have been very, very unlikely without the climate destabilization that's primarily been caused by climate pollution primarily from fossil fuels, that we should not be calling these events natural disasters. Just for one example, I don't know the rainfall totals from different towns in the state, but what this chart that's visualized by the Washington Post shows is that there were 2 100-year rainfall events, or events that would otherwise be expected to only occur once, have a 1% chance of happening in any given year. 2 100-year rainfall events in Montpelier specifically. I'm sure that it was likely the case in other communities in the state, but 2 100-year rainfall events in Montpelier in 12 years. And that's what climate destabilization looks like. It's gambling against an opponent that's playing with loaded dice, and makes these events more frequent and extreme. And so it's a minor thing, but I think language is important. And one of the things I'm thinking a lot about is we need to stop calling these natural disasters. These are fossil fuel disasters, because we have a responsibility to fix the problem, not put it off on nature or something that we can't control.
All right, Jane, and then TJ.
Jane, we cannot hear you, or at least I cannot.
Maybe we should switch over to TJ. Jane, you cannot be.
All right. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, sorry. I've been gun shy to participate, mostly because I know I was going to have trouble with audio, but I've been listening to the meeting today, and thank you. I've been traveling, so haven't been able to actively engage, but I thought I would just respond with two kind of what feels like hopeful directions for our state, like in response to some of the comments that were just made and work that the Climate Office is coordinating in conjunction with our partners at other state agencies and within our agency. But one of the one-time funding projects that we'll be doing next year is actually trying to do what we think might be the first statewide look at something very similar to what we did in the mitigation space with the cost abatement curve, is actually to do a resilience cost curve that actually looks at the deferred costs of investing in resilience strategies and actions now. And we're starting to prepare an RFI and working really closely with the Gund Institute and others who have experience in this space, and FEMA and others, to look at how we can make the case for investing in what are awfully really costly strategies and actions, and think about the avoided costs and damages that we would save from these kinds of, I'll borrow Jared's language, fossil fuel disasters later in time. Obviously, it's a lot harder. It's like an insurance policy kind of, and you never know if you're going to need it, but really important to try to make the case and have some talking points around the cost. And then second, I'll just say that the Climate Action Office has also been working really closely over the last few days to support and put together a climate resilience package for the Secretary and others to consider as they meet with the congressional delegation later this week. And we've been asked to think about not only not only to speak to the good resilience and adaptation work we're doing across state government and elsewhere already, but also demonstrate sort of project ready projects for now that we can put on the ground, and also demonstrate the systems change that we need to build into the system to actually be able to respond sooner and faster, as well as mitigate the impacts. And so we're thinking about things like fuel switching, we're thinking about weatherization, we're also thinking about how we can deploy that right away so people aren't locking into fossil fuel infrastructure, and what that looks like from resilience package. And we're thinking about it much broader than obviously those kinds of things as well, thinking about how programs like the River Easement Program, which is one of really the most successful conservation tools we have in the state, meets the scale and demand of what we need to do with respect to restoring our rivers in a changing climate. So the package is huge, and it's been nothing but sort of monumental to test the ability of the Climate Office to coordinate really quickly to put together a really meaningful and impactful memo and package for the congressional delegation. And it's been really humbling to work with so many people to do that. So I just want to say that our little state is mighty, and we're able to do great things, and from stuff like this can come better results. So excited to sort of see where it goes.
Thanks very much, Jane. I like that mighty word.
Hey, I know TJ is a family, but Jane, that's awesome. Is that something that you can share when it's publicly available? I'd love to see this, read about it. It sounds amazing.
I'm sure it will become public over time. Yes.
Yeah. Thanks, Jane, for all of that. I think, and the positive tone. I raised my hand to push back a little bit on the characterization or the inference that our state government is asleep at the switch or not making the connection between what is happening in our state and what needs to happen. I think it's pretty well known that we've put hundreds of millions of dollars, allocated hundreds of millions of dollars towards investments that move towards the goals of the Climate Action Plan and the Comprehensive Energy Plan. I think right now workforce is a big limitation, and that's a long-term problem related to housing. Investments are being made in those areas. Our business as usual forecast that has been updated. We had a presentation last time, showed that VEIC projects that we're going to have more heat pumps installed than what the Climate Action Plan modeled was necessary to meet in the mitigation scenario. Also says they're worth less than originally assumed. So there's still more to go. But my point is that we're moving on a lot of things. And I think it's a pretty convenient narrative that people like to talk about, that, hey, the state government isn't doing anything here. And it is just very far from the truth. And, just because a preferred policy, which, aside for whether I thought it was a good idea personally or not, everybody knows the governor vetoed the clean heat standard, but that shouldn't, that's an overarching policy and one way to get to our solutions. And at the current moment, I think a lot of people have acknowledged we're moving pretty quickly on this stuff. I mean, we have $35 million of weatherization money that Efficiency Vermont has chosen not to take right away because we're quibbling over how much they should get paid to provide this for customers. And then that money is holding up because it was legislatively tied other money with water heaters and electric service panel upgrades. And so, it's not, I just want the Climate Council and folks to just, take stock of what is actually happening, not what folks think is hearing or is a convenient narrative. We're moving in a lot of sectors, and I just need to make sure that people are aware of that, because it is a convenient political narrative to say something different.
Thanks, TJ. Anything further from members of the committee? Okay, then I judge that we've reached the end of this meeting. We've agreed on a couple of action steps with respect to New York. And thanks, Jane, for the report. Thanks, everybody, for your observations. We can stand adjourned.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.